Today I wanted to take a step back and answer a question I am commonly asked, which is off topic from my usual in-depth history videos, and this is, what are my top 10 ships? As I think it's quite common for people to ask others what their favorite items out of whatever interests they have are, and so today I decided I will answer that question. This list is not specific to warships or peacetime vessels. I'm incorporating both. Coming in at number 10, we have the König-class battleships for the Imperial German Navy. Discussions regarding the König-class began in late 1909 as essentially being an improved variation of the preceding Kaiser-class, and the Germans ended up rearranging the main battery turrets to where all were on the center line. The König's design was the next step in modernizing battleship designs within Germany. However, the design of the ship is not really why it found its way on this list, but rather its excellent service history. Next to the German battle cruisers, the König class were the most active capital ships in the Imperial German Navy, and they ended up being amongst the most active warships during the First World War, and these ships took some serious beatings during the war, but none of them were sunk. Some examples of the damage they would receive is during the Battle of Jutland. They would come under fire from the 15-inch guns of the Queen Elizabeth-class battleships, which the shells were kept out of the citadel. 2 of the ships would be struck by torpedoes, and in 1917, 2 of the ships would strike mines, with one of them striking 2 mines nearly simultaneously. These were well-tested ships that were overall excellently designed, and they held their ground throughout the entire war, with all of them being scuttled by their own crews in Scapa Flow in 1919. Coming in at number 9, we have the SS Deutschland, which was a 4-funnel ocean liner constructed for the Hamburg America line that entered service in 1900. Deutschland was ordered by the Hamburg America line from the Vulcan Iron Works in response to the German Lloyd line's Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse, which was also constructed at Vulcan. Robert Zimmermann, who designed Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse, would also design Deutschland, and Deutschland would be far from the success that Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse was, and really, the ability to make fun of this ship is why it's amongst my favorites. Deutschland's career was so clowny that it is almost staggering how bad this ship actually was. The ship could hardly run at full speed because of extreme vibrations that were let off by the engines, and the engines themselves suffered from bad friction, which meant they broke down quite often. The ship never gained momentum amongst the public, and was never popular unlike its 4 competitors. In 1906, Hamburg America lost their small cruise vessel Kronprinzessin and Victoria Luise, and in 1910 it was decided to withdraw Deutschland from service since it was not profitable, and it was outclassed by the more recent British liners, and it was converted into a cruise liner itself and renamed Victoria Luise. The ship performed all right as a cruise liner until 1914 when World War I kicked off, and it would effectively spend the whole war doing nothing until it went through another conversion in 1920 into the immigrant/cargo ship Hansa. During this conversion, the ship's engineering spaces were rearranged for the 3rd time during its service life, and it would remain as Hansa until 1925 when it was finally sold for scrap. It's really a favorite because it was a ship with a lot of promise that did not pay off at all. Coming in at number 8, we have the IJN Soryu. This was Japan's 5th aircraft carrier, and it was finally when they got the ticket right. As designed, Soryu was supposed to be what is known as a flying deck cruiser, which was effectively a cruiser/aircraft carrier. However, following the Tomaruzu incident, where a torpedo boat capsized and the stability was calculated, the ship had to be redesigned, and Japan finally decided to dump the idea of mounting cruiser guns on an aircraft carrier, as the carrier should focus on aircraft. The Soryu was considered a compromised design as it was of the so-called medium type, so it was heavier than a light carrier, but it was not as heavy as a full-fledged fleet carrier. The ship's statistics were overall mediocre. It carried decent air groups, decent armor, and decent anti-aircraft guns. However, it was a shining star in the speed department as it was capable of 34 knots, which was very fast for the time. What really made Soryu amazing is the fact that it was the basis for all of Japan's future aircraft carriers. Soryu was the foundation of Japan's modern carrier fleet. Soryu overall was not a very impressive design. It was just okay. However, the mark it made in the Imperial Japanese Navy is why the ship is interesting to me. Coming in at number 7, we have the Derfflinger-class battlecruisers for the Imperial German Navy. Now at this point, it's starting to sound like I am a German simp, however I assure you this is the last German vessel that will find its way on the list. The reason Derfflinger is on this list is because effectively it has all of the points that the König had going for it, except now it is in the form of a battlecruiser that was even more active than the König. These ships, like the König class, were also tested under various types of fire throughout World War I, and the second vessel, Lutzow, was the only battlecruiser Germany lost during the war from enemy gunfire. Without being a broken record on the König section of the video, the Derfflingers were overall well designed, had excellent service histories, and the ships themselves were aesthetically pleasing. Though this is not important, it is a personal touch. Coming in at number 6, we have the Cunard ocean liner Mauretania. Now this spot could effectively be shared with its sister ship Lusitania, however, I gave Mauretania the spotlight because the vessel ended up having a more successful career than its slightly elder sister. Mauretania entered service in November of 1907 and took the blue ribbon from Lusitania. In 1908, the ship would test 2 experimental 4-bladed propellers that came to great success, and the ship eventually received all 4 6 months later in April of 1909, and all Cunarders for the next several decades would run on these propellers. The ship remained highly profitable throughout its life, and it was really a symbol of British pride. Mauretania's life was also largely uninterrupted. The ship only had one major incident in which a fire nearly engulfed the ship. However, it was extinguished after extensive damage had been done in first-class spaces, but this ended up allowing the ship to go through a reconstruction in the 1920s that resulted in its coal-burning boilers being replaced with oil-burning ones. In the mid-1930s, the Cunard White Star Line ended up selling the ship for scrap, and it's one of the rare occasions where the public had an outcry about a vessel being scrapped, as there were many attempts made to save it, to no avail. The ship was scrapped within 2 years. Mauretania had an overall excellent design, solid service history, and it was regarded highly by the public it served. At number 5, we have the Yamato-class battleships for the Imperial Japanese Navy. Now obviously these ships are not on the list for their service histories, as they did absolutely nothing except get sunk and kill several thousand Japanese sailors. The ship is solely on this list because of its design history. As most of you whom are familiar with my channel are aware, I am a simp for ship designs, and the Yamatos had an extensive and very interesting design history that goes all the way back to 1929 with unofficial projects until the A140 project was officially commenced in late 1934. 3 of the greatest minds were placed on the project to create a variety of designs. These men were Hiraga, Fujimoto, and Fukuda. Unfortunately, in January of 1935, before the project got very far, Fujimoto died of a stroke as a result of his drinking. The project mainly fell under Fukuda, whom had taken the designs from Fujimoto and began to improve upon them, and Fukuda himself was a former student of Hiraga. This meant that over 30 years of battleship development went into the Yamatos, with 10 of those years being active research in new defense systems. In being the world's largest battleships, they had the ability to carry statistics that no other battleship had the ability to, such as unmatched caliber guns and unrivaled armor thicknesses. And the application of all of these systems ended up making an overall efficient platform, but the ship entered life at a time where the battleship was effectively dead. Combine that with the fact that Japan was not a nation that was well suited for operating a ship of this size, meant that the ship would end up being absolutely worthless during wartime. The care put into this design for it to not be used is what makes the ship very interesting to me. With that having been said, that leads us into number 4, HMS Hood for the Royal Navy. To be straight out about Hood, it is in my top 5, mainly because of a personal attachment to the ship. Hood's effect that it had during its service life is still lasting to this day. There is something magnificent about the design of this vessel that most people just can't describe. Hood's design was a dividing line in capital ship construction history, as it was the final capital ship constructed without an immunity zone. For those who are not familiar with what an immunity zone is, This is a set range at which the ship's armor system can protect its citadel from its own caliber of guns. Following Jutland, Hood's armor scheme was in fact updated compared to what it was initially supposed to be. However, in the 1920s, when conducting tests on the updated armor scheme, the British found that Hood's own guns could still enter the citadel at any range. Hood was a humongous ship for its time frame as well, coming in at 864 feet long and displacing more than 40,000 tons, with 8 15-inch guns, which is arguably a relatively light armament for a ship of this size. However, the ship was not big for the armament, but for the propulsion system to propel it at 32 knots. It was your typical British battlecruiser of a modernized design. Hood would spend its career as the pride of the Royal Navy. It would attend celebrations around the world, participate in major fleet maneuvers, and it even found itself victim of a mutiny in 1931 as the result of Royal Navy pay cuts. Hood started the war rather successfully in the Mediterranean against the Italian and French navies, but when pinned up against the Bismarck in the Denmark Strait in May of 1941, the ship's after magazines detonated 10 minutes after action began, and it took all but 3 of its crew to the bottom of the ocean with it. This is one of the examples on the list where the vessel was excellent during peacetime, but ended up being a disaster during war. Coming in at number 3, we have the final British vessel to appear on this list in the form of the RMS Aquitania for the Cunard Line. Lusitania and Mauretania had proved resounding successes. However, Cunard could not keep up a weekly schedule with just 2 ships, and so in 1910 they realized they needed to add a 3rd ship, though they decided to not copy the Lusitania design. Initially, 7 designs were submitted of a vessel that was slightly smaller and slightly slower than Lusitania and Mauretania, with it being roughly around 770 feet long and capable of about 22 to 23 knots. Its overall appearance was described as being effectively a copy of Mauretania, just slightly scaled down. However, in late 1910, Cunard gave an outline for how many people the ship was intended to carry, and it was expected to be around 4,500 people, so this meant the ship actually had to be scaled up from the Lusitania and Mauretania, and this would result in the design that ended up being constructed as the largest Cunarder of the time period, the most successful one, the most modern one, and the longest-serving one. The ship ended up being 901 feet long, nearly 46,000 tons standard displacement, and it was capable of carrying just over 4,200 people. This is one of the rare ocean liners in history where it was designed to serve for 25 years maximum, but ended up doing 35 years, which meant it served for a decade alongside its own successors. The ship's overall modern design made it very popular amongst the public it served, which resulted in it being one of the most profitable ocean liners operated during its time frame. It also holds the pride of serving its nation in both world wars. Aquitania has just found itself as one of the most interesting ocean liners for me to study, in both a design and service history aspect, as the ship was just so successful overall. Speaking of being successful, that brings us into number 2, the Shokaku-class aircraft carriers for the Imperial Japanese Navy. If you are invested in studying successful aircraft carriers, you don't have to look much further than the Pacific War, as there were plenty to choose from. But for me, the Shokaku class is the one that's always grabbed my attention the most. Earlier in the video, I had heavily hinted that Soru was the dividing line between junky Japanese carriers and good ones. Shokaku was the epitome of the Soru type design. What makes Shokaku such a good aircraft carrier for me is the fact that, unlike the Soru, which was of a constricted size, and unlike the Akagi and Kaga, which were of similar size but are conversions, is the fact that the Japanese were able to design an aircraft carrier with modern ideas in mind from the Soru, but from scratch without restrictions. This meant that the Shokaku and Zuikaku had the most powerful propulsion system of any Japanese warship, alongside with Taiho, which had the exact same system installed, at 168,000 shaft horsepower, giving them a top speed of 34.5 knots. They also had large air groups, excellent armor for an aircraft carrier, and a heavy anti-aircraft complement. They also incorporated a series of new defensive qualities, such as updated damage control systems, an updated torpedo defense system, and updated expansion holes for their hangars and flight deck. During wartime, these ships were highly active, and they were capable of holding their ground independently for several years. Both of these ships would also receive extensive punishment throughout the war. Of course, most of it was focused on Shokaku, and it really showed that the defensive systems the Japanese had placed on these ships worked quite effectively. Both ships would receive more than a dozen hits apiece between bombs and torpedoes throughout the war, and they required extensive damage before either were sunk in action. They had an amazing design, excellent service history, and they were very prideful ships. Even with Shokaku and Zuikaku being ships that I can praise all day and all night, they're still not in my number one spot, as that goes to the USS Monitor. Monitor is not here because of its design or construction. I have openly criticized both in the past on this channel, and will probably continue to do so in the future, as it wasn't a very good ship overall. However, it is here because of a personal attachment to it. It is the first ship I learned about and began studying, so it is why I got into maritime history, and for a couple of years I worked at the museum that houses the recovered artifacts from the ship, like its turret, engine, guns, and various other minor components. All of the other ships on this list I have had the benefit of studying, but actually being able to come into contact with them is a different thing. In the years leading up to me becoming employed at the museum, I would occasionally go there and stare at the turret for hours on end. Once when I was finally employed there, I had access to the lab, and standing in the same room as the first turret that was used in naval warfare, it's an indescribable experience. But what I really think hits the heart the most with the Monitor story for me is not the large items themselves, but rather the small personal effects like coat buttons, boots, a coat itself, silverware with engravings on it, rings, and unfortunately, the two skeletons that were recovered with the turret. It is the reason I study maritime history, the human side of the ship's story. Regardless of how often I mention people in my videos, it must always be kept in mind that people were designing these vessels, people served on them, and in many cases, people perished with them. Getting the story of their accomplishments out, even if I'm not doing it person by person, is what it's all about. And for me, Monitor is the symbolic embodiment of that. With that having been said, that concludes my top 10 list. I would be interested in hearing what some of your top 10 lists are as well, because not everybody has the same top 10 list, otherwise it would be extraordinarily boring. And I'd also like to see what you guys think of my top 10 list and possibly some of the reasoning I gave for it. My list hasn't changed in several years, as I'm very satisfied with the ships that I have placed on it. So, with that, hopefully you have enjoyed today's video. If so, why not leave a like and a comment down below, and have a wonderful day.